be outside. I right before this started, about half an hour before the start of the program, I thought it would be wise to do another reminder because I was worried that people would come here in their heels and without a chair, or maybe they would know that it was outdoor church and they'd be nervous because earlier they looked out at the fog and they'd be like, there's no way I'm going to outdoor church. So partially as a way to make sure, like a last-ditch effort, to let people know it is outdoor church, it is nice, please come, I went ahead and put a quick little photo up on the socials of them practicing, saying, great day to be alive. I didn't say that actually, but it's a beautiful day, be sure to join us. But I have to confess that that wasn't the sole reason that I posted that. The other half of the reason, maybe the 60% part of the reason, was that I wanted to make sure that some other friends of mine knew what we were doing today. Because you see, earlier this summer when I arrived, I had a lot of friends from the Northwest who were giving me a hard time about their beautiful weather and the hot and humid weather out here. And they would send me these private messages that I didn't tell you about the way they were treating me, but they were treating me kind of bad that way, right? And so now all of a sudden I'm realizing they're not going to have outdoor church today. And so I went ahead and made sure I would let people from other parts of the world know that we're enjoying the sun, because what a beautiful day it is. And I would never imagine that this is what it feels like around here as we're approaching Thanksgiving week. It's been a little bit odd, right? Because you walk right over here and there's a beautiful Christmas tree, and then you walk outside and you're like looking for your sunglasses, like where did I put them? Or you go down Main Street area, it's not actually called Main Street, is it? But the main downtown area of Calhoun, and all the Christmas decorations are out and you're driving around with your sunroof open. It's kind of a beautiful thing. I can get used to this. This isn't a bad situation, so I've been loving it. And I love this transition that we're in right now of seasons, stepping into the holiday season. Because for me, I love the holidays, but I'm a holiday purist, okay? And so when the decorations were coming out earlier, it bothered me a little bit. You know how it is, like, it's not even Halloween yet. Halloween's about to happen, and before Halloween, you're walking into the store, and all the Christmas decorations are exploding everywhere. And I get it, some people are planning ahead and they want to buy their Christmas stuff now, but it always chafes me a bit, and especially when it's like 80 degrees, it just doesn't feel right. But then you get into the early parts of November, and I guess it was just last week, I was grabbing some supplies at the grocery store, and Christmas music was on full blast. And I'm thinking, no, you can't do this yet. I'm not going to judge you. If you're an early Christmas music person, that's okay. I'm not going to distance myself from you for that. You can make that personal choice. That's an individual freedom that you have. But don't blast it on the public, speakers when I'm shopping at the grocery store. It's just not right. But the second that I reached this week, I feel like we have now moved into the holiday season, because for me, Thanksgiving is like the start of it all, and it's almost like the precursor to the rest of the year as you just celebrate the holidays. And as we go into this week, it just feels right to start having, and I guess caving in to some of the Christmas stuff that's around the corner. But part of it too is that I just love Thanksgiving. Like, I've always liked Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's a great holiday, well, for lots of reasons, but one is because I like food, right? I like food a lot, and it's one of the few holidays that food plays such a central role. You might eat a good meal at Christmas, but you can kind of deal without it. But you can't go through Thanksgiving without a really good meal. If you do, you feel like you didn't actually have Thanksgiving. So it's one of my favorite holidays. I love the food that we have. And I don't know what your traditions are, but one is, in my family growing up, it was dinner roast. We would splurge, and we didn't live close to the ABC in our area, but someone would make the journey sometime in the month prior to get the dinner roast and bring it home. And that was an excellent thing. It's not just the dinner roast I enjoy at Thanksgiving meal, but then it lasts. We usually buy a couple extra loaves of this stuff, and you cut it up, and it's lunch the next day. And it's delightful. I just love, this is probably a sign of being raised vegetarian, because people who aren't may not have the same enthusiasm for some kind of veggie meat, or any veggie meat for that matter. But it's always like a special thing, is getting the dinner roast or the mashed potatoes. And I don't even like cranberry jelly, but I eat it. Come Thanksgiving, it feels like it's part of my holiday celebration, I'll just shovel that stuff down because I'm celebrating Thanksgiving and I get really into it. There's only a couple of things I don't like about Thanksgiving. I was telling the seventh graders this week about one of the things I have never liked at my meal, Thanksgiving dinner. This is on my side of the family, and this is the blessing of not being live streamed right now. It's that I know my mom's not listening, but she might later. I'll suffer, but she knows this. There was one vegetable I hated growing up, and that was lima beans. I could eat most things, but I hate, and to this day I still don't like them. I never buy them on purpose. It's an accident if they show up in my house. I don't like lima beans that much. And it's not like the flavor's that bad, it's just the texture. They're always dry and pasty inside. There's nothing good about lima beans. Like there's always, you could find a better substitute. If you want to get greens in, get peas, get green beans, get anything, right? But lima beans, I never liked lima beans, but my parents love lima beans. And so growing up, this is always a big deal, is that they would always have lima beans at St. At least once a week, there'd be lima beans that would make it onto our dinner table. And they were determined they were going to have me like lima beans. And so how do you make a kid like it? You force them to eat it. And so this was a ritual at my house that I would have to sit at the table until I finished my lima beans. And it wasn't like I just didn't like them a little bit. I would gag on them. I would try to eat them, and I would try to do the right son thing. I'll eat my vegetables. And then I would start to have this heaving kind of reaction. I just couldn't swallow them down. And then I'd be left at the table all alone. Everyone had finished the meal, and I'd still be left with my lima beans, and I wasn't allowed to leave the table until the lima beans were done. Well, what's this have to do with Thanksgiving? Well, Thanksgiving, one of the featured dishes that we would have prepared was creamed lima beans. Has anyone ever had creamed lima beans or ever heard of creamed lima beans? The idea is like you put in like butter and sugar and you make this kind of like, I described it to the seventh graders as slug-like consistency that you stir the lima beans into. And then it gets kind of this sweet, buttery, gooey kind of mixture. And my family just thought this was such the delicacy. Every one of them, every last one of them loved it. You like lima beans a little bit, come Thanksgiving dinner, you loved lima beans. But for me, it was always taking something that was already bad and making it about 20 times worse. If I couldn't handle lima beans in their raw form, I could not even stomach the sight of the creamed lima beans. But my family was determined, this is just a prejudice of mine, and they would, again, force me to eat them, saying, you're gonna like these more, these are so much better. And every year is the same thing, like it would ruin my Thanksgiving meal. And even to this day, whenever I visit family, lima beans, creamed lima beans will be on the menu, and then my kids have learned of my disdain, and my kids will torment me about it now. It's just a never-ending trial of mine. But there's another area that I'm a little bit more ashamed of to say that sometimes is one of my less favorite things about Thanksgiving, because I know probably at least 50% of you, maybe more, are going to do this week. And I'll probably do it at my house too. But again, my family's not here right now, so I can share it. This is just a moment of trust between us, okay? Can we have a moment of trust? Sometimes, not every year, but sometimes I don't like the ritual of going around the table and saying what you're thankful for. Do you guys do this at your place? You go around the table and it's like before we can break it, and you've been salivating over this food all day. And you've smelled it, you're ready for it, you sit down, you're like, okay, let's say the blessing, and let's dig in. And then somebody, usually it's a mother-like figure, sorry moms, will say, wait, before we begin, let's go around the table and say something that you're thankful for. And one reason I kind of don't like this is because it's delaying the food I've been waiting for. That's very impatient of me, I recognize, but that's where I'm at. The other thing that I don't like is sometimes I feel like I'm coming up empty. Have you ever had this? Like there's some years where it's just immediately like, in my family when we do this, it's usually, it's not like just this week, but it's a reflection of the year. Like as the year is coming close to an end, let's look back over this year and think about what are the things that we're grateful for that have brought us to this moment right here. And there's some years where it just kind of spills out naturally. It's like, man, this year God has blessed us in this way. And this year things are going well here. And I'm so thankful for this. But there's other years where it just sort of feels like a rote practice where I don't necessarily feel something coming up from the heart, and I will just say something And it just feels like we're not really being genuine in that moment. Sometimes it just feels like we'll just say these cliche things, like I'm thankful for this or I'm thankful for that, and we'll say it, but it's not really feeling it in my heart. And it kind of feels like this Hallmark moment, right? It just feels almost sappy sweet. And if I'm not actually feeling a genuine moment of gratitude there, it's one of my least favorite parts about Thanksgiving. Don't stop it. I think this is a good practice. Like in light of what we're talking about today, this is a good practice, but sometimes it's a struggle. Sometimes it's a struggle to feel thanksgiving, to feel gratitude in your life when things aren't going the way you wish that they were. And the thing is, this isn't just your mom who tells you to go around the table and say something you're grateful for. There's a particular passage in the Bible that has a similar ring to it, and that's found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, it's a short 3 little verses here. Short 3 verses that have a similar kind of ring to it. There's 1 Thessalonians 5, and I'm reading 16 to 18. It'll be over before you know it. Even as you're looking up, you're gonna miss this. But you can keep your finger there because we'll continually refer to this. 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 through 18, it says, "Rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. I feel like Paul just really lays it on thick here. He doesn't kind of beat around the bush. He's telling us to do this. Well, first of all, you'll notice how it ends. Do this, why? Not because your mom asked you to go around and say things you're grateful for at the Thanksgiving meal before you eat. He says, do this, be thankful for all things, or in all things, because it's God's will for you to do this. Have you ever had someone tell you that it's God's will for you to do something? If you've been so fortunate to have someone tell you that, it's often actually not a fortunate feeling moment. Often, like, who are you to tell me what God's will is? Like, who are you to tell me how I should act or what choice I should be making? But it's something that we wonder all the time, isn't it? I mean, if you want a best-selling book, find a new spin on finding God's will in your life. Right? These books sell like hotcakes because all of us are wanting direction in our life. All of us are wanting to know what is God's will for me. And usually we're thinking of it from a very specific, what's the path of life that I'm looking for? Does God want me to go into this kind of major when I go into college? Is this the kind of career he's calling me to? Is God wanting me to date this person? Is God wanting me to marry this person? What's God's will in this moment? How do I know what God's will is? Is God wanting me to move and be closer to family? Is that God's will, or is this just something that I've thought up on my own? We're always asking, like, what is God's will? When truth is, there's certain things that are very clear. And one of them is right here. Paul makes it crystal clear. What's God's will for you? It's to rejoice always. It's to pray continually. And in all circumstances, to give thanks. And I'm going to kind of skip over the pray continually because I feel like this takes us down a different path, though prayer, I am sure, is connected to gratitude and joy. But these two bookends here, the joy and the gratitude, to rejoice, which again is just like the verbal form of joy, and in some translations it'll just say be joyful always, and then to give gratitude. And it has this all-encompassing moment. Like, sure, it's easy to do this when things are there for you that you want to rejoice in, right? Like, it's easy to do this if you feel like, man, I just got that promotion. Yeah, I got the thing I was aiming for at work. Or, man, I just nailed it with my grades this year. Straight A's. I'm doing so well. So much to be joyful about. So much to have gratitude over. But it doesn't say when things are going well. It doesn't say to do this when life is just all peachy keen, but to do it always, rejoice always, and then to give thanks in all circumstances, which of course is telling us in the ups and downs, when life is good, when life is bad, in all these moments, give thanks. And you have to wonder, like, well, how are you supposed to do that? I can do that sometimes, but I'm not sure if I can do that all the time. And the truth is, even when life is going well, sometimes it's hard to be full of gratitude. or to be full of joy? There was an interview a long time ago, I think this is back in 2005, with Tom Brady, and Tom Brady was just, already becoming known as a star here. And this was with Tom Brady winning an interview after he had already won 3 Super Bowls. And he says, this is on 60 Minutes, he says, "Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me?" I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, "Hey man, this is what it is. I reached my goal, my dream, my life." But me, I think, God, it's got to be more than this. I mean, this isn't, this can't be all of it. This can't be what it's all cracked up to be. And then he's asked, of the 3 rings that he's gotten so far, which is his favorite one. My favorite ring, I've always said, I always said it's the next one. The next one is the best. Not specifically talking about Thanksgiving per se, but I feel like it's kind of captured in that moment. Like, which one are you most grateful for? The next one. Never quite satisfied. Still have an itch, still have a yearning. So even when things are going well, it's still not there. Or even more recently, Jim Carrey, just this year in an interview, talking about when he was in kind of a dark place and just realized that he wasn't happy even though he had reached the pinnacle of acting success. And he says this, he says, "I guess that just getting to this place where you have everything everybody has desired and realizing that you are still unhappy, that you can still be unhappy, is a shock when you've accomplished everything you ever dreamed of and more. And then you realize, it's not about this. And I wish for everyone to be able to accomplish those things so that they can see that." In other words, he's saying, I wish that you could accomplish the things that you dream of, because once you get there, you'll realize that's not what you've actually been yearning for. You're yearning for something more. So even when you have life go your way, even when things are doing just what you want them to do, you will still find that sometimes you're still not full of gratitude. You will still find that sometimes you're not full of joy. And then in this specific case, when you wonder, what's the situation that Paul's addressing here with the Thessalonians? We don't really exactly know, but we know that life probably wasn't simply easy for them either. If you jump back to the beginning of the book, in the welcome, he says that they're welcomed. The message of Jesus, he's reflecting when they took in the gospel, which is recorded in Acts chapter 17. You welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering. And then he continues in the next chapter that you have suffered from your own people. These are people that are going through and have been going through some kind of persecution. Now, I always feel like it's necessary to say when we talk about Christians enduring persecution, that we probably don't really understand that for the most part. Right? In America, I feel like we often talk about Christians being marginalized, or Christians being cut off in some kind of way, or Christians even being persecuted, but I don't think the kinds of things that we complain about are the kinds of things that they were going through. Rather, they were actually experiencing real, tangible suffering, things that would make you question your safety. So what kind of things are we talking about? If you go back to the very beginning of when they accept the gospel through Paul, we find it recorded in Acts chapter 17, verse 5. It says this, it says, "But other Jews were jealous of the message that Paul was promoting. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace. They formed a mob, and they started a riot in the city. And they rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out of the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers from the city officials, shouting, 'These men who have caused trouble all over the world have come now here.' And Jason is welcomed into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus." And when they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil, and then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. And as soon as it was night, the believers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. So in other words, Paul and Silas, when they come to this place, when they plant this church, when they begin the message, the work in Thessalonica, at this moment, things get so rough that they have to sneak out of the city for fear of their own safety. And it appears that that type of persecution, that type of crowd mob response continues when Paul's writing to them in 1 Thessalonians. And so when he's talking to them about being grateful in all circumstances, having gratitude in all circumstances, I think it's worth noting that they were probably experiencing some kind of trauma in their life. And it's from their own people, is the way it's described. So this is started by, in the Acts story, it's started by Jews who kind of come in and they don't like the message and they pass this message on. But by the time we get to Thessalonians here, their own countrymen, their own people are now also persecuting them. Perhaps some of their own family, their own friends, people that they live and work amongst are now persecuting them. They don't like what's happening. They see the message of a Jesus King as a threat to their own kingdom here in this world, and they're being marginalized. Now, I think it's interesting when we mention this. I think it's important to just make a distinction here that when Paul says be thankful in all circumstances, I don't think he's saying be thankful for all circumstances. There's a difference there, right? The in and the for. And so I don't think when you go through something bad, you have to kind of chin up, shoulder that thing and say, God, I'm so thankful that this is happening to me. I'm so thankful that the cancer has come back, right? I'm so thankful that I've experienced this great loss. I'm so thankful that she broke my heart. I don't think that's what we're actually called to do, where we kind of live in this alternate reality where negative things happen and then we assume that that's God doing it to us and he's going to grow us through that, so we need to be thankful for that thing. But rather it's saying to have a heart of gratitude in the midst of the things that you're going through. You will go through bad things. Some of us have gone through significant bad things. But the question is, in the midst of that, can we still find gratitude? Can we still express gratitude from our hearts? And I'm thinking again in this particular context as we approach Thanksgiving, the reason why this text kind of drew me in is because I was thinking that, man, this year is such a weird year to celebrate Thanksgiving. Even all the ups and the downs of life, whatever it is that makes it hard, some of us are having a really weird Thanksgiving this year. It's just not going to look like what you've done in the past. Some of us have kind of been on the fence trying to decide, well, do I see this person or do I not see this person? Or maybe I need to exclude this person for their own safety. Or maybe I just need to stay completely home. Or this was the plan that we had at the beginning of the year, but now it's not. It's not going to work. I know we've had a lot of conversations in my house just this week talking about how things were going to be adjusted for the way we were going to celebrate Thanksgiving. And then even more so talking about the Christmas season and wondering, well, I don't think that things that we thought we were going to do are actually going to be able to happen now. So we have this kind of weird relationship to this holiday where sometimes it's hard to be grateful. But in the midst of whatever positive or negative thing we're having, we're told that we can indeed be thankful. And I think there's a connection between making that choice of gratitude and experiencing joy in our lives. I feel like I quote from Brene Brown, perhaps too much, but I feel like she always talks into whatever kind of issue we're looking at. But I was looking at some of her commentary on gratitude, and she says this. She says, the relationship between joy and gratitude was one of the more important things that I found in my research. I wasn't expecting it, but in my 12 years of research on 11,000 pieces of data, I did not interview one person who had described themselves as joyful who also did not actively practice gratitude in their life. She said, for me, this was counterintuitive because I went into the research thinking that the relationship between joy and gratitude was if you are joyful, then you should be grateful. But it wasn't that way at all. Instead, it's the reverse, that the gratitude is the thing that brings out the joy. She goes on to say this, without exception, every person I interviewed who described living a joyful life or described themselves as joyful actively practiced gratitude and attributed their joyfulness to that practice. In other words, they're taking tangible steps of having a heart of gratitude. They're writing in a journal. They're actively having a discipline where they go through what are the things that I'm grateful for. She says that both joy and gratitude were described as spiritual practices that were bound in a belief in human interconnectedness and a power greater than ours. If you want to have gratitude, it takes a discipline of doing it. And if you want to have joy, it takes that gratitude. If you want to have gratitude, it takes the discipline of being a grateful person. Like Josh was saying during the children's story, of exercising that muscle, making use of it. And that it takes having a framework of believing that there's a higher power that's connecting the world around you. And when you have those two things, it helps you in that practice of gratitude. There was a book that came out that was talking about, well, this is back in 2007, but it was talking about thankfulness, and the book is simply called Thanks, and it's based on a bunch of research by this guy named Robert Emmons. And he says this, he says, preliminary findings suggest that those who regularly practice grateful thinking do reap emotional, physical, and interpersonal benefits. Adults who keep gratitude journals on a regular basis exercise more regularly, they report fewer illness symptoms, and they feel better about their lives as a whole and are more optimistic about the future. In other words, the gratitude practice has a positive impact on all areas of your life. But here's the question that I really have. Does the gratitude come from something that we already are? How many of you know a really severe optimist in your life? You know somebody who just, no matter what, they're always sunny and they always have that great disposition. Life can go bad, but they always see the glass as half full. You see, there are some people in life who the idea of gratitude comes pretty easily. And quite frankly, those people are frustrating, right? If you don't have that same experience, if you don't naturally feel gratitude for things, if you don't naturally have a sunny disposition, the person who does can be a little bit annoying because they can tell you, well, just do this, and it works for them, but it doesn't work for you. If you're someone who's a little bit more cynical, or someone who has a little bit harder time seeing the glass as half full, sometimes it can be a little bit harder to be full of gratitude. Well, in this book, it talks about that. It talks about how part of what makes up whether you're a person full of thanksgiving does have to do with your they call it your genetic set point, kind of where you sort of land. And the set point is sort of where you always come back to. And so if you have a genetic set point that's full of gratitude, when something goes wrong in your life, you will feel a dip where you don't feel as thankful for the world around you. But given enough time, given just a little bit of healing, after that breakup, after that job loss, after that thing that doesn't go well, you will kind of reset back to your normal set point. Same thing though, if something goes very well. You win the lottery. And in that moment, you feel very grateful because suddenly you don't have to worry about the finances that you were worried about before, even though you don't play the lottery, right? That's not part of our official church policy. But imagine you just suddenly won this inheritance. Your gratefulness would go sky high, but only for a short period of time. Eventually, you will go back to your genetic set point. So the ups and downs of life will kind of do this, but eventually you reach this one place. Well, according to the studies that they did, they found that your genetic set point makes up for about 50% of your relationship towards gratitude. Then you have 10% with the circumstances around you. So only 60% from the thing you were just dealt with, the genetics you were born with, just sort of who you are wired to be, 50%. Then you add another 10% for the things you go through. The girl who says I love you, the boy who asks you out to that banquet, the A that you get, whatever it is, these different things make up 60% of your grateful heart that brings you joy. The other 40% has to do with your intentional activity or your behavior surrounding gratitude. In other words, 40% of this attitude comes from the practice of gratitude. Usually we think about it in relationships to the 10%. We think about, man, if I could just buy my first house, if I could just accumulate enough wealth to retire in peace, if I could just simply raise my kids and have them kind of turn out to be decent human beings rather than monsters, I will be happy if I get to that moment. If I just have all these different things, whatever your priorities are, if I could just lose this weight, if I could get to this goal, it feels like those are the moments that we're going to experience joy and have something to be thankful about. But the reality is it's the wrong focus. Because it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter how positive or how negative. Those things only comprise about 10% of your relationship towards gratitude. 40%, the part that you can actually control, has to do with your willingness to exercise the discipline of choosing gratitude, choosing to go through these things. And so when Paul says, be thankful in all circumstances, I feel like he's telling us to exercise that thing. But there's one other component that I feel like is important to understand what it means to be a person of gratitude, and that's looking at the word itself. So if you look at the word itself that Paul uses here, it's a word that you will recognize. In the verb form, it's eucharistio, which is the verb of the noun Eucharist. And you might recognize that word Eucharist, right? We don't use it as Adventists. That's a Catholic word, but it's not really a Catholic word because it's a Bible word. It's a Greek word that we see used throughout the New Testament. In fact, the reason why we tie the Eucharist, and of course when we're talking about the Eucharist, when the church is talking about the Eucharist, when they're experiencing it, we're talking about practicing the Lord's Supper, and they'll call it the Eucharist. The reason why is because if you go back into the Gospels, when Jesus is about to celebrate the last Passover, and he's about to have the Last Supper, what he does is he gives thanksgiving. He gives thanks for the bread. He says, the Eucharist. Now, I've always wondered, like in my family, we have, in my dad's side, all of them always talk about grace in their prayer. Like, we're going to have grace over the food that we have. And this is always interesting to me because, like, why grace? Don't we just either give thanks or say the blessing? But the reason why some people will say grace for the prayer that we do before the meal is because grace is the root word for Eucharist. So the Greek word, bear with me for a second on this, all right? The Greek word for grace is charis. So if you can kind of picture, I'd have this on the screen, it'll make it better, but if you can picture the word Eucharist, the charis in the middle is grace. And you suddenly start to realize there's this tie-in between grace and thanksgiving and the sacrifice of Jesus. One person says it like this. They said that thankfulness and grace are inseparable. If you want to experience God's grace, then you must begin to practice thankfulness, especially during times of brokenness. And especially during times of brokenness, because you recognize that when Jesus does this, when he gives thanks for this bread, he gives thanks, recognizing the bread that he breaks represents his body that's about to be broken. The thanks that he gives for the juice, for the wine, is about thanks for the blood that's about to be spilled. He gives thanksgiving in the midst of the brokenness that he is about to experience and endure himself. Hebrews 12 says it this way. It says that he counted it as joy as he's entering into this suffering, because he expects the suffering is going to have a reward that will come out of it. But I would take this and I would flip it the other way around. It's not that you must experience grace through thankfulness, but in order to experience thankfulness, I think we need to experience grace. That when we accept the grace of God through all of life's circumstances, that will allow us to actually have a natural spring of gratitude in our hearts. So we're going to close with something different. We're going to celebrate the Eucharist. We're going to celebrate the Last Supper. Right now, as we have this closing song, we're going to have the bread and the wine distributed. I have some volunteers who are going to pass this out. As they do this, we're going to do this safe. And so as they come, if one of you and your family group just raise your hand and say how many you would like for your family, and they will hand them to you rather than you reaching in. And as they do this, as you take this, and as we prepare to participate in the Lord's Supper, I want you to think about what ways grace has been poured out in your life. What ways have you experienced God's grace? What ways do you need to experience God's grace in your life? And as we accept the gift of God through this token, we can actually experience real gratitude in our lives. So I want you to think about that as this last song is played, and then when I come back, we will take communion together.